Good morning, and welcome to Positively Politics, the show where we break down the sometimes complicated and often negative world of politics in a straightforward and academically rooted way. My name is Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson. I'm a professor of political science here at the University of Indianapolis, as well as the host of this show. And whether you're catching us here live on WICR 88.7 The Diamond, or wherever you get your podcast, this show is all about asking questions, inciting conversations, bringing in historical data, context to give us a greater sense of what's going on in the world. And I often try to highlight something that I think doesn't get enough attention or is worth further examination, or quite frankly, I look at topics that I'm curious about and I think, whoa, what's the history here? What's the backstory? Why does this happen? It's quite frankly, it's a labor of love, emphasis on the love. It's pretty light on labor, but trying to give that deep dive and examination. That's exactly what Positively Politics is about. And that's what we're doing here this morning. I'm going to talk about cabinet positions, and in particular, where we stand now in 2026. We can say bye to three, not one, not two, but three members of the president's cabinet who have been fired from the president in recent months. Most recently, we had the labor secretary, Chavez-DeRemer, was fired. Before that, you had Pam Bondi at the beginning of April as Attorney General. Before that, you had Kristi Noem at the beginning of March. It almost felt sequential in terms of these firings. And I wanted to talk about both the specific details of those firings, as we say bye, but also the importance of the cabinet. The importance of these roles, and in a phrase that I think we oftentimes overlook, which is that members of the cabinet serve at the president's pleasure, right? So they respond to the president. The president can fire them at any time. We say serve at the pleasure of the president or at the will. The president has the right to dismiss them and doesn't need the approval of the Senate. They do need that approval, of course, to be put in office. It doesn't have to necessarily have a reason, although you wouldn't just do this on a whim necessarily, right? So I wanted to talk about what the cabinet does, the role, the responsibilities of the cabinet, what formal powers they have vis-a-vis the Constitution, but also the informal role that we've seen members of the cabinet play. And then the individual instances here, as we're talking about Noem, Bondi, and Chavez-DeRemer, where we would say, perhaps these are people who weren't doing a good job. Perhaps they just weren't doing a good job by the perspective of the president. Perhaps, and I'm thinking in particular of Noem, and I think this is an important one to dive into, they had their own political ambitions, as many people in politics do, and they let that get ahead of their official role, their current role, right? Thinking forward and not present into what they should be doing. So that's what we're going to talk about here on Positively Politics. For WICR or wherever you get your podcast, I'm Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson. Let's start with the basics of the cabinet, right? When I describe the cabinet to others, and people say, what it really is the cabinet, the term itself is very vague. I always think of a piece of furniture, and I think that's just weird, quite frankly. I don't know why that's why we call it. That's not really what I care about. It is the innermost circle of people closest to the president. Think policy advisors, think people who are obviously the same political party for the most part. Lincoln was very unique in his construction of a cabinet. But most presidents are going to identify people that are experts in that field, that are loyal to the president. Perhaps they helped out during the campaign or they've paid their dues in another way. Typically, they're people who are experts in the field. So they're not necessarily elected leaders. They're not necessarily politicians. But there are exceptions, of course, for that, too. I think right now, in terms of Marco Rubio, his name is high up there, by the way, when you're looking at 2028. And I know we haven't gotten through 2027 or 2026. We have some multiple elections before then. But when we're looking to the next presidential election, Marco Rubio has great name recognition right now in terms of being Secretary of State and our involvement internationally. He is someone certainly to watch, right? And he had previously served as a senator from Florida. But many of the people, and in fact, all the ones that I'm talking about, most of the ones I'm talking about, Kristi Noem had served an elected official, but many of them are experts in their fields. They're not necessarily politicians. So when we think of this inner circle, right? These are the leaders of these executive departments. And I want to talk just briefly about the role of the cabinet, right, in the Constitution, because first and foremost, though I said I think that word is really weird, the Constitution doesn't explicitly say cabinet, but though they don't directly establish a cabinet, they are discussed, this group of inner circle, in the opinion clause in Article 2, right? Article 2 covers the presidency. Article 1 is Congress. Article 3 is the courts. Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1. And it talks about the principal officers of departments that can provide advice to the president. Hence, we're talking about what becomes the inner circle, the cabinet. You could also add to this, and I've seen people expand on this and when you talk about the 25th Amendment, because this provides that if the president is unable to, they say, discharge the powers and duties of his office, that the vice president, along with the heads of these executive departments, could help take over. So it does informally, formal in terms of the language in the Constitution, but would give them some more latitude in terms of policy and really decision-making power if the 25th Amendment were applied, with the president being unable to, again, discharge the powers and duties of office. Now, when we look in terms of the composition of the cabinet, right, I mentioned they provide specialized advice. They are seen as that inner circle. Okay. Right now, the cabinet has 23 members. And I say right now because there's some positions that don't change, but we have seen expansions of these. So first of all, the vice president is a member of the cabinet. And then you have 15 department heads. Now, that is an area in which we've seen change because we have the oldest departments. The Secretary of State is the highest ranking member of the cabinet, right? And fourth in line in succession to the vice president, to the president, because you have the president, vice president, Speaker of the House, President Pro Tem of Senate, and then it goes to Secretary of State. And then you go to the newest office created. So thinking about Department of Homeland Security, Secretary of Homeland Security would be the newest one. But there are 15 department heads. Each one of those begins with Secretary of, is a part of the cabinet. And then there are 7 cabinet level officials, right? Now, almost all of these require Senate confirmation. Obviously, the vice president does not. And one thing that I learned when I had one of my friends from graduate school worked in a presidential administration, I took a group of students on a field trip there, and she was absolutely delightful. It's my friend Jenna, and she told us something that I never learned in graduate school, but I find fascinating, is that in terms of these cabinet meetings, right, the highest ranking, and that's with regards to the office, like the oldest office, right? Thus makes a high ranking. So Secretary of State is going to sit very close to the president, whereas the newest cabinet member, the newest, I should say, department, it doesn't matter how old the cabinet members are, how long they've served, but the newest department, like Homeland Security, is going to sit the furthest away. Right? Now, all the cabinet officials report directly to the president. So the vice president works alongside the president sometimes, oftentimes seems subordinate. Typically, the vice president's in a really particular position where you want to look like you're supporting the president, but you also may have your own agenda. You may have your own interests. I mentioned presidential elections. Oftentimes, vice presidents are looking at that next step up. And whereas in this current climate, to contrast someone like Marco Rubio, who I think has great name recognition, he gets a lot of press right now. He's very engaged and involved. Lots of attention on him as the Secretary of State. Right? J.D. Vance is doing Trump's work, right? J.D. Vance came to Indiana multiple times with regards to redistricting last year, right? The vice president is doing what the president wants and then also trying when he can to get his name and face out there because he might also, and I would suspect he is, interested in running in 2028. Now, you're listening here to Positively Politics. I'm on WICR 88.7 The Diamond. You can also catch this show and old episodes wherever you get your podcast. I'm Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson. We're talking today about the cabinet. And in particular, I'm discussing this because we saw a successive number of cabinet officials, March, Kristi Noem, April, Pam Bondi, later in April, Lori Chavez-DeRemer, right? A number of cabinet officials fired by President Trump. And we're going to get to those specific instances, but I wanted to cover just a little bit more in terms of the tradition of the cabinet and the roles that they play, right? Formally and informally, you could say that they provide advice. Right? And think of it in this way. The president is a generalist in terms of study and action. So individual presidents come to the office with their own experiences, education, right? They will have their own areas of expertise. And it varies on the president, what positions they've held before, what they've done, whether in public service or in the private sector, in terms of what their real areas of expertise are. But by and large, when you're thinking of somebody in these kind of leadership roles, they are a generalist. They have to be good. They have to know. They have to make decisions on everything. The same applies for a governor or the mayor. The same extends beyond just the executive branch positions that I'm mentioning, right? For legislators in the state house or members of Congress, again, they will be on their own assigned committees, sure, but they will be responsible for voting and debating and deciding legislation on a variety of topics and policies. Now, the one exception to this generalist argument here that I'm making for these elected officials, I would say for school board members, they are tailored, they're focused. When we talk about local governments, we talk about a general all-purpose government, and we talk about specialized local governments. Right? Members of the school board, if you have a library board, a water board, right, they're focused on the specific parameters of their position. So those ones may be a little bit more specialized, but the president certainly is not. And that's where you have that perfect relationship between the cabinet that is specialized, that focuses, if we're talking about the labor secretary, right? Focusing, has a background and hopefully a lot of expertise and experience in that particular area and can provide advice to the president, right? Regarding what they see as the most important things in their field, regarding their own expertise, to give that advice to the president to ensure that the president is considering that when making decisions. Now, cabinet members also provide leadership for their own departments. So when we say, for example, Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, right? He has an undersecretary. He has an entire hierarchy of members when you talk about diplomats, ambassadors, the State Department, right? Very complex bureaucracy that he heads and is responsible for. He will receive a budget from the president vis-a-vis Congress and their congressional approval. And part of his responsibility is making sure that he's able to fulfill the responsibilities in that department, all of his subordinates in that department, with the money and the funding that they have. So budget management's important. Obviously, implementing the laws. These are members of the bureaucracy when we're talking about the cabinet. And I always think of the bureaucracy, it feels very amorphous, ambiguous. But the bureaucracy is just anything that is department of, agency of, commission, blah, 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 blah. That means they belong to the executive branch. And the president, of course, is the leader of the executive branch, right? But the president will make decisions based on the advice, the guidance of these executive branch members. And in turn, it is part of their responsibility to implement the laws, right? So to be able to see the laws that are passed through Congress, through the president's advice, guidance, the members of the cabinet are responsible for not just their own department, but agencies that fall under and the implementation. And finally, the personnel themselves, right? And these are very complex, intricate bureaucracies. When we talk about the American government, and I think this is a common talking point, especially in American government, we say like, oh, the government's gotten so big. Oh, American government's just so huge, right? It's not that we have any more members of Congress now than we did 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And it's not that we have more presidents or vice presidents, right? We've always had one, but we're talking, of course, about the bureaucracy and the expansion of the bureaucracy that oftentimes is responsive to legislation passed by Congress that, of course, the bureaucracy has to implement. Now, in addition to these kind of positions, right, there are a lot of cabinet rank status to other key roles. So I mentioned the executive departments, anything that's a secretary of, right? The vice president is the only member of the cabinet who's not appointed by the president, but they run on the same ticket as the president, and the presidential candidates get to select their vice president. So I say it in jest. They're not appointed to the cabinet. Let's be clear on that, right? The president certainly has some say in the selection of the vice president. You also oftentimes have chief of staff. That's the person that serves the president directly. The CIA director, right? Administrator of the EPA, things like that. So that's just an overview in terms of the cabinet. And you're listening here on Positively Politics. We're talking today about three members of the cabinet gone. I'm going to highlight them next, but I'm Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson. You're listening to WICR 88.7 The Diamond, or wherever you get your podcasts, you can find Positively Politics, this episode and previous ones. So let's get into the more recent issues. I want to focus on this as a topic because we saw Kristi Noem, Pam Bondi, right, Lori Chavez-DeRemer, 3 firings within the span of what was essentially 2 months from the cabinet. And first and foremost, I wanted to cut through what I think sometimes are assumptions or almost like urban legends about the cabinet. Right? Oh my gosh, the president's getting rid of people left and right. No, the president has been in office for a year and a half, and President Trump is certainly no stranger to controversy. But we see these positions oftentimes in administrations as rotating. Now, there's some that are more stable. I would point to, I've talked about Marco Rubio, but Secretary of State, that one tends to be very high profile, right? Very exhausting, but oftentimes more stable. But remember, the members of the cabinet serve at the president's discretion, right? And by the way, as I kind of highlight some of the people that are serving in these roles, the White House website, that's whitehouse.gov, actually has a list with pictures, biography, and every person who's a member of the cabinet. I find it fun to go through and read, especially as you look through. I mentioned many of these people will be experts in their fields, but there are several who are or have served in elected office before. I'm looking at Doug Burgum. He's the Secretary of the Interior. Sean Duffy, who was a representative from Wisconsin. He's now Secretary of Transportation. Tulsi Gabbard, who had served in the state legislature from Hawaii and had kind of been involved in politics before and after, right? A lot of people here that serve in these kind of capacities, but highly recommend looking at that website. Now let's talk about Kristi Noem. She was the first firing on March 5th. It was a Thursday. I remember it well because there had been rumblings just earlier. I'm talking days earlier where people said, oh, it looks like Noem might be out. Right? Trump is getting ready to fire Noem. And what would have given people, insiders, right, this inkling? Well, for starters, Noem had been testifying with regards to her role as Secretary of Homeland Security, because Secretary of Homeland Security is responsible for, among other things, ICE. And you might recall there were 2 fatal shootings on people in Minnesota through ICE raids, disputes with other agencies, right, causing a lot of controversy, bringing a lot of attention to the Department of Homeland Security. And by virtue of being the secretary, that was something that Noem had to respond to. There was that, which I would say is the political, right? Those are the political pieces that didn't do Noem any favor. But in addition to that, you had the personal. And this is one of the tricky things for members of the cabinet, for vice president, right? All these people are political animals to some extent. Right? Especially in the Trump administration. As I look through that list of cabinet members, many of these people have served in elected office before. So they are political in that way. And there's nothing wrong with that. But if you have been involved in politics, you may be interested in continuing to be involved in politics and not just serving in a bureaucratic position, but perhaps running for, again, president someday. And that seemed to be one of the things that Noem was particularly interested in. Now, she had served in state government before, and she was seen as someone who, could be a rising star. I will say, I thought she had presidential potential until her biography came out. It talked about the way her family treated her dog. People really responded negatively. You can look that up if you're interested. But part of the reason why many believe that Noem was fired from her position as Secretary of Homeland Security back in March was because of things that she was doing to promote herself, and not really the position nor the president's positions. I think this is in particular very interesting. One members of Congress flagged the $220 million ad campaign that Noem was featured very prominently in, that she had funded, it seemed, without presidential approval, right? She was riding in front of Mount Rushmore on horseback, right, talking about what she was doing. And though it's not an explicit campaign ad by any standard, right, it doesn't take a stretch of the imagination to understand that that's more or less what it felt like, right? It was not talking truly. It didn't feel like you were getting the message about the Department of Homeland Security or what President Trump is doing to secure the borders, right? And actually, to that point, apparently there was a lot of beef. There was a lot of controversy between Tom Homan, who's the border czar, and Kristi Noem serving as the Secretary of Homeland Security. And those are two positions that would need to work pretty intricately together. So there was that. This is what I called the personal side, right? There's the political, just like providing the service. There's the personal. And once she was fired from that role, Mark Wayne Mullen of Oklahoma was named as the replacement and now serves in that position. Now, she was essentially demoted to a lower position within that office. I still think when people say, like, well, is it demotion? Is it firing? Well, you're leaving one position unwillingly, right? And the president has the right to do that. Remember the phrase we like to say, right? They serve at the pleasure, right? Whomever is on the cabinet serves as the pleasure of the president. And the president has the right to dismiss them at any time. And that's exactly what he did when we're talking about Kristi Noem as Secretary of Homeland Security. Now, I don't know what her future holds. That certainly drops her down in terms of position in the public eye, not just the controversy of being fired, right? But having that platform, which is informally very helpful for future candidates running for office, not having that can hurt. Now, you're listening here. I'm Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson to Positively Politics, whether you're listening where you get your podcast or on WICR 88.7 The Diamond. We're talking today about bye. 3 members of the cabinet gone this spring. I just discussed Kristi Noem, who was fired in early March as the Secretary of Homeland Security. I'm going to talk now about Pam Bondi. We're going sequentially here. Now, she began last year as Attorney General, and again, no stranger to controversy, but ultimately was fired back in April 2nd. For her role as Attorney General. And there were several explanations, several theories as to why Bondi was released from this position, right? As part of her role as Attorney General, this is the most powerful of the women I'm talking about this morning that have been fired from the cabinet. Attorney General is often seen as very powerful in part because they represent the country in lawsuits, whether states are suing the federal government or local entities. I think recently, because of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Supreme Court decision involving Louisiana that essentially erodes Section 2 of the VRA, looking back to other important Supreme Court decisions that really hit the ERA hard. If you go to Section 5 and the decision Shelby County versus Holder, Shelby County is literally a county in Alabama suing the federal government. Who do they sue? They sue the Attorney General. At the time, this was the Obama administration in 2013, and Eric Holder was the Attorney General under Obama. So the Attorney General is incredibly important, incredibly powerful. It's just much more so than Secretary of State or Labor, if we're just going to be really blunt here. But because of that, you have a lot of power. There's also going to be a lot of focus on what you do, and there's going to be a recognition of the ramifications. And of course, the Epstein files have been a major talking point. They've been a big political news story throughout the last few years. But there was a lot of concern about the way that she handled and the way that she handled the Department of Justice's handling of the files related to Jeffrey Epstein, whether she released the records properly, properly redacted names, released everything in its entirety, right? Properly redacting victims' names, their identities, right? And just it felt like many clumsy mistakes. And of course, the question is that I don't think we ever really get to, like, were they mistakes? Were they intentional? Was this political? Was this personal? Was this just truly a comedy of errors, lacking, of course, the humor and the comedy part? You never know entirely. She also seemed to not get along with the president increasingly, and that's going to be a problem when, again, you serve at the will of the president. She'd been seen as someone who's very loyal, but we've seen people go in and out. Talk about Marjorie Taylor Greene. Now, was a member of Congress from Georgia, right? So not a member of the cabinet, but someone who had really been seen as a loyalist, if you will, as a friend, as someone who championed President Trump and did a 180 and left her office because she was so disgusted, in her own words, disillusioned with what the president was doing. So certainly it does happen, though Bondi was seen as someone who really was aligned with the president. And another thing that people often suspect with her is that she really didn't aggressively prosecute people that the president didn't like. You have Letitia James, who's the New York Attorney General. You have Jim Comey, the former FBI director who had been indicted earlier, right? And the president feeling that she wasn't doing enough. All of those reasons, of course, were explanations for Pam Bondi's firing as Attorney General. Now, I'm Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson. As you're listening here to Positively Politics on WICR or wherever you get your podcast, I want to talk about the last firing we saw. We say bye, bye, bye. That's bye to Kristi Noem, bye to Pam Bondi. Now bye to Lori Chavez-DeRemer. Now she was fired at the end of April, serving as the labor secretary. Now there were questions about Kristi Noem and a relationship with Corey Lewandowski. When you talk about personal versus political, if we look at Chavez-DeRemer, a lot of the details for this resignation, wasn't completely fired, but resigned. So I think it does give the illusion wasn't willing, right? In part because of allegations of improper conduct, relationships that she had, reports that she was drinking on the job, and concern about her performance, what she was doing, mostly concerns and questions about misconduct. And when we think about things like this, it's very clear to me, reading everything about the resignation / firing, that it had very little to do with how Chavez-DeRemer actually did her job leading as labor secretary. But I do think this highlights, obviously, ethics matter, personal conduct matters, how you behave and whether you follow rules are very important to members of the secretary too. They serve at the will of the president. They are approved by the Senate, but they are still individuals that are serving in a public capacity, even if they're not elected by the American public. And so those components, those things matter. A lot of times when we talk about political scandals, and it'd be a stretch to call Chavez-DeRemer necessarily a scandal. I think it seems pretty isolated as I did my research in terms of what she did that was unique to her as a person. This was not condoned by the entire administration, but nonetheless, these scandals do taint the leaders who appointed people to these positions, and oftentimes in ways that we could question whether or not it's very fair, right? You select a person, presumably, that you think is good and you hope is good, but you are not responsible for every individual who reports to you and their behavior. Once you are aware of it, you do have now a burden of responsibility, right? But you don't necessarily know that ahead of time. And so when we look at former labor secretary Lori Chavez-DeRemer and her firing / resignation from that position, to me, it's very clear that it's based on a personal behavior. And it reminds us that though the cabinet is not expressly mentioned in the Constitution, and though we look at these bureaucratic positions with very little constitutional premise for what they do. They are responsible for implementing the laws. They're responsible for advising the president. They also have a responsibility to the American public in terms of accountability, transparency, displaying moral and ethical values. There's a lot of subjectivity there, I realize, but something like drinking on the job and berating or abusing subordinates, we would say, even with the gray areas of morality or ethics, that would be unacceptable. And that is likely exactly the reason why lawyer Chavez-DeRemer was fired/resigned from that position. Now, when we look at the cabinet, it is oftentimes a revolving door of personalities, but all incredibly important in informing and providing advice to the president that does influence what the president chooses to do or not to do with policies and everything else. But bye, 3 fewer members, 3 new members now in President Trump's second administration cabinet. I want to thank you for tuning in and listening to Positively Politics. You can listen here wherever you get your podcast and on WICR 88.7 The Diamond. I'm Dr. Laura Merrifield Wilson.